Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining. This is the fourth video in our Bible study on the Gospel of Luke. Today's reading is a fairly short one, so I want to try to do a little bit more in this video today than just focus on this one passage. I also want to do a little more today by way of previewing Jesus' public ministry as a whole. If you haven't read the passage from Luke 4 for this session yet, I invite you, as usual, to pause this video and take a little bit of time with it. Today's reading kickstarts Jesus' public ministry. Up to this point, we've read through just the authorial introduction to the book and the infancy narrative. Last week, we read through the story of Jesus' baptism, and we saw how the genealogy right after the baptism almost serves as a deep breath for the narrator of this story. It was a pause, it's a transition point, and now we're moving into something different, a different phase of the story, if you will. We'll come back to the particulars of today's reading in a bit, but I want to point out to you first a couple of things about the shape of the story of Jesus' ministry that takes off from here as a whole. The first thing that I want to point out involves geography. Now, you can see here that I've drawn a map of Israel. You can see the Dead Sea and the Sea of Tiberias up here, and the Mediterranean is out there. Geography is very important in this gospel because, number one, Jesus is Israel's Messiah. And so it's an important part of the underlying theological message of this book that Jesus makes it all the way around to the different parts of this country in his public ministry. He makes sure that he gets to the very border. He spends some time in the north. He spends some time in the south. His most immediate ministry in this gospel is to the Jewish people at this point in time, and geography of Luke tells that story. But geography is also significant because of the way that Jesus refuses to stay within the geographical boundaries of this territory. He sometimes wanders into non-Jewish regions like Tyre and Sidon, which are up here. And as we'll soon see, transgressing those territorial boundaries goes hand in hand with the theology that the gospel he's come to bring isn't just for the Jews. It's also for the Gentiles, and that message is literally written into the geographical landscape of this gospel because of where Jesus travels to. And the third major reason that the geographical itinerary of the gospel is so thematically important is because of how huge a role Jesus' journey toward the cross plays in this gospel. As we read in our readings for today, Jesus starts out in the south of this country. Last week we read about him being baptized in the Jordan, and now he's wandering into the wilderness down here to fast and to pray. In all likelihood, he's talking about the Judean wilderness there, which is the region in the south that ran along the western side of the Dead Sea, as you can see here. But the very next thing we hear, and we also read this for today, is that he's gone back up to his home in Nazareth, up there in the north, and then to Bethlehem to be born. And then he's gone back home to Nazareth in Galilee, So up to this point, he's been, before he was born, first of all to Nazareth, and then down to Bethlehem to be born, then to Jerusalem. And notice that unlike Matthew's account, there's no flight to Egypt in Luke. And then he's to the Jordan to be baptized, and then he's back up to the north in Galilee again, and that's where the bulk of Jesus' ministry occurs in Luke. We frequently hear the names of towns like Capernaum and Tiberias. All of these towns are along the Sea of Galilee, and he's out fishing on that sea, and he's recruiting his disciples along that sea, and casting the pigs into the sea, and feeding the 5,000 along the shores of the sea, taming its winds, etc., etc. For all that's happening here in this gospel, most of it is happening in a relatively confined geographical space. One of the reasons why that's significant is that for as small as this geographical space is, it's a remarkably diverse area, religiously and culturally. You've got Greek cities in this area with foreign inhabitants, where you might run into a Roman centurion, for example. You've got Jewish peasantry all throughout this region. A lot of them, several of them become Jesus' disciples. You've got Pharisees, you've got Syrians and Phoenicians living throughout this northern area in the northern region of Israel. And if you want to take the gospel first to a diverse cosmopolitan region within the borders of Israel, this is the place to come. But something important changes in the geographical tenor of the gospel when you get to chapter 9, verse 51. There it says, "When the days drew near for him to be taken up, he set his face toward Jerusalem." And listen to how many times that orientation toward Jerusalem occurs in the rest of this gospel. It happens in chapter 9, verse 53, and chapter 13, verses 33 through 34, chapter 17, verse 11, chapter 18, verse 31, chapter 19, verse 28. In all of those passages, he's still up north here in the Galilee, wandering around and carrying out his public ministry. But that journey toward Jerusalem, that journey to the cross, is now looming in the background of this gospel. It's hovering now in the back of the readers' minds and in the back of the tellers' minds, because Luke keeps drawing our attention back to the fact that Jesus is now on his way somehow down here to Jerusalem. So geography is really important in Luke. Geography is part of the theological message underlying Jesus' public ministry, and the geography also shapes the way that the literary structure of this gospel is written because of how central a place that journey to Jerusalem plays. You know, it's because Jesus is thinking of himself as being on the way to Jerusalem for most of this gospel that he can tell the disciples not just to follow him, but to take up their cross and to follow him, because they're literally on their way to the cross for most of this gospel. We'll talk more about that in a few weeks. So let's return to our reading for today then. First, he's in the wilderness fasting and praying, becoming prepared, you might say, for the ministry that lies ahead. He has a showdown with Satan over priorities and values. He's setting a stake in the sand, you might say, for a public ministry that has a clear kingdom purpose in opposition to the way worldly values and powers typically work. The second scene here, though, is the one that I really want to focus on the most, because this is where the public phase of his ministry really gets started. And it's here that we first hear the word gospel, evangelion. It's here where he discloses that the kingdom has drawn near, and these words fulfilled in their hearing. And it's here where Jesus does a little self-disclosure by publicly accepting the label of a prophet. So here he is. Jesus has now made his announcement. I am the one who's come to bring the gospel, to bring good news to the poor, release to the captives, sight to the blind, freedom for the oppressed. And all of that sounds really great. In fact, if you read back again to chapter 4, verse 22, he got rave reviews for that sermon. They loved him at first, and they seemed anxious to hear more from him. For a split second there, Jesus was a pretty popular guy and well received among his people. But look back at what happened next. In verses 24 through 31, he calls to mind two stories from the Hebrew scriptures for his hearers there. The first is a story about Elijah. Once, when there was a severe famine in the land and many Israelite widows in need, it was the Sidonite, the Phoenician, the Gentile woman that Elijah helped. And second, at a time when leprosy was running rampant, as Jesus tells it, it was the Syrian, again, the Gentile man, Naaman, that Elisha healed. In other words, Jesus' public ministry in Luke starts out with something like a Gentile Lives Matter campaign, and all of a sudden, there goes all of his popularity. They're escorting him to the side of the cliff now to throw him off. It's a really curious passage. It's a really provocative way, if we can just back up for it for a second, to introduce what Jesus' public ministry is going to be about. There's this theme of the good news having some material reality to it. Jesus has come not just to say, believe in me, but to heal and to free the oppressed. Not just to indoctrinate them, but literally to be the Messiah for them. But there's also this transgressiveness to this ministry as well. It breaks down boundaries. It's offensive. It gets involved in, it involves getting into a little bit of trouble, perhaps. It eschews the kind of popularity that the devil put on offer in the wilderness in favor of a purer vision of the kingdom of God. You know, those are themes that are worth pausing to chew on as we get moving forward into this new part of the gospel. And so I want to leave you with a couple of questions to think on as usual. And number one, if this passage that we read for today was all that you had to go by, how would you define gospel? And you know, gospel, the word gospel, good news, is there in verse 18 of our reading for today. If this was all that you had to go by, how would you define that term gospel? Number two, why did Jesus do that? Why did he sacrifice all of that initial enthusiasm and energy and popularity to come out of the gate of his public ministry and be upsetting? Why did Jesus do that? And third and last, how does the theme of an upsetting and at the same time healing gospel play out in Jesus' life and ministry? How does the theme of an upsetting and healing gospel at the same time play out in Jesus' life and ministry? Well, I hope you've enjoyed today's session. I hope this video enriches your reading of the gospel, and I look forward to our meeting on Zoom. Be blessed.